Thank you, Tsering, and my sincere thanks to the Dean and the faculty at JSW Law School. It is a true honor to be here with you in this beautiful country, so thank you. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about compliance, particularly, and the challenges with respect to compliance. I'm an international lawyer, and so when I think about compliance, what do I mean? Fundamentally, I mean, let's see, where do I need to aim this to make it click? There we go. Compliance, a state of conformity or identity between an actor's behavior and a specified legal rule. What does this mean essentially? It means, do we comply with the law? Do we follow the law? And what I want to ask is whether the problems we have dealing with climate change are about not following the laws, or are the laws not good enough? Because ultimately, when we start to dig in, we see that states are complying with the legal rules we've created around climate change. But my basic point is those legal rules don't go far enough to solve the problem that we face. So I want to distinguish between compliance, which I've just talked about, and if I can have the next slide, effectiveness. Effectiveness, let's see, is there something I'm doing? Oh, there it is. All right, I'll just tell you when to advance the slides because the clicker doesn't seem to be working. Effectiveness, instead, is whether the rule we've created as lawyers solves the problem we created the rule for. And if we create a bunch of rules that don't actually solve the problem we face, we might comply with them, but we won't be effective in doing so. If I can have the next slide. So what is our objective, right? We have actually agreed on what the objective should be. Thanks to the Paris Agreement, we know, and this is text you've all seen before, that our goal is to keep global temperature rise below 2 degrees, and preferably below 1.5 degrees. And secondly, to make sure that happens, to make finance flows consistent with achieving these goals. That's the objective. And what we need to ask ourselves as lawyers is, have we created a set of legal rules that achieves those goals and objectives? Next slide, please. So what are the commitments states have made? If we think back both to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and then the Paris Agreement, when we boil it down to its simplest form, what are the commitments states have made? Well, each party in Paris says that they're going to prepare and communicate a nationally determined contribution, and that each nationally determined contribution is going to go a little further than the last one. That, unfortunately, is a pretty limited commitment. It's what states were willing to do. And remember, international law is a system without a higher power to impose rules on us. The rules are only what states are willing to commit to. And the lesson of Kyoto was that states weren't willing to make clear and specific across-the-board commitments. So here we get the commitment. This is what states have to comply with. Next slide. What else do they have to comply with? Well, they have to create a goal on adaptation, and that developing countries are supposed to provide financial resources. But look at these commitments. Imagine for a minute that these were not commitments about climate change, but the legal rules about how to drive your car down the road. What would happen if the rules were this vague? This doesn't tell us how much money states have to commit. It doesn't tell us how big a commitment to reducing their carbon footprint states need to make. This is a recipe for not being clear, right? This is a very vague set of standards. It is critically important because it's what states were willing to agree to. But when we start asking questions about are states complying with the rules, states set a very low bar for themselves because they didn't make bold, ambitious commitments. The next slide, if I could. And when we ask about compliance, my answer is compliance is pretty good. The states highlighted on this map in the sort of green-blue color have made their NDCs, and the new NDCs are better than the last NDCs, and that's what you're committed to do. It's not perfect. The states in gray have not done so, but more or less, states are making NDC commitments. The next slide. What about money? Well, remember, Paris doesn't say how much money. That 100 billion number is not in the language of the treaty. And if you look, a lot of developing countries are making financial flows. They're not enough. They're making them. The U.S. commitment is tiny compared to what it needs to be to solve the problem. But can we say that the U.S. isn't complying with its Paris obligation? No, it is complying. It's just not complying with a bold enough commitment. The next slide, please. Well, are these rules effective? If they're being more or less complied with, then we turn to ask, are they effective? And the answer is a resounding no. The IPCC tells us the emissions gap remains large. Even the new NDC pledges are only going to get us to 7.5 degrees. Essentially, we need to significantly further reduce our NDC commitments if we're going to make the 2% goal. The next slide. And global warming is going to go to 2.7 degrees even with the commitments that have been made. In other words, the commitments are not effective against the policy problem we have identified. Next slide. What about financial flows? They're being made, but as we see in the Glasgow decision text from the Glasgow COP, the COP notes with deep regret that the goal of developed country parties to mobilize 100 billion was not met on time. Not effective. Next slide. What about adaptation? That's the other commitment we talked about. Too little, too late is the basic answer. While there's a lot of adaptation projects in the pipeline, they are not sufficient to meet the adaptation goal that was set out in Paris. So, next slide, please. The story is that compliance, not perfect. Compliance with international law is never perfect because there is no international police force to come and make countries do what we want them to. But compliance isn't the problem. Effectiveness is the failure. We need to fix compliance. We got to get the states that haven't made their NDC commitments to do so. And critically, we have to hold states' feet to the fire that have made commitments and not lived up to them. But in addition, we must make the legal rules more effective. And how do we do that? We've got to raise ambition. And we've got to make commitments that are bolder than what states were willing to do in Paris. Next slide, please. All right, so what are our paths toward compliance? How do we get better compliance out of the states that are not yet complying with their Paris commitments? I'm going to talk about 5 ways we can do that. Let me take the first of them on the next slide, which is, are there things within the Paris Agreement itself that could help get states to be better at complying? Article 15 of the Paris Agreement puts forth the construction of a mechanism to facilitate implementation and to promote compliance. That's UN speak for saying, let's create something to make sure states keep their promises. Turns out this mechanism is deeply underdeveloped. The next slide shows us the first sort of working efforts on creating this coming out of Katowice, but this committee is not yet up and running, and it's not a court. It's not going to be something that can force a state's hand, but at best, maybe it can ensure that there is some more transparency and some naming and shaming of states that don't meet their commitments. So there is an internal mechanism, but again, it's a relatively weak one. Next slide. So if we don't have a strong internal enforcement mechanism, what else can we do to get states to comply? Well, transparency may be your best bet, and that's why I'm glad we've linked transparency and compliance here. We need to be out there scoring countries' NDCs and highlighting where they fall short. And then we need to make sure that countries actually meet those commitments, because it is very easy to make a pledge. It is very hard to make the domestic changes in your economy necessary to fulfill those. And thankfully, the Paris Agreement recognizes the importance of transparency. But we need more treaty-based mechanisms to ensure that transparency is realized. Next slide. We also need leadership, because it turns out that to get states to do things, somebody has to lead the way. States rarely, out of pure altruism, do the right thing, but they often are willing to follow when other countries take the lead. And I'll give you one example of this. I'm usually good at criticizing the United States, but I'm actually going to applaud the United States for a moment, which is that when Barack Obama and Xi Jinping sat down 2 years before the Paris Agreement, and the US and China made big commitments about their post-2025 climate goals, that opened the door to every other country in the world being willing to come to Paris and make that commitment. We need leadership. Too often, the United States is not the leader to look to. Biden's been better than previous presidents. So where could we look? Well, maybe we're standing in the right place to look. Because even if Bhutan is a small country, the story Bhutan can tell about being the first country to become carbon zero, that is an act of leadership, of really powerful leadership, and we need more of it from Bhutan and from lots of other countries that are taking innovative steps in this space. Next up. Well, what else can we do to promote compliance? Well, we're lawyers. What are we trained to do? Go to court. Let's go to court and sue. The UN Framework Convention for Climate Change did contemplate lawsuits. It gives jurisdiction to the International Court of Justice over disputes under the UNFCCC. Unfortunately, next slide, the Paris Agreement does not include such a referral to the ICJ. And that is why we don't have countries able to sue one another to say you're not meeting your NDC pledges. We are seeing new efforts at litigation, and they were just referred to in the past presentation. Vanuatu has asked the UN General Assembly to essentially refer a question of climate to the ICJ. This might be helpful. But states don't necessarily comply with ICJ decisions. They certainly don't comply with non-binding advisory opinions. And I'm not even sure that the court's going to come out and say there is an obligation beyond what's in the Paris Agreement. So I'm not sure this is going to work, but it's worth a try. So too, there is an effort to bring a case before the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea. Next slide. But the real story about litigation is not international law litigation. It's domestic law litigation. Every country listed on the screen there currently has one or more pending cases that are essentially challenging a government's climate policy. There are 1,143 of them pending in the United States at the moment. And domestic litigation can work. Why? Because countries follow their own domestic courts. Next slide. In the Netherlands, a case 2 years ago forced the Netherlands to change its electricity policy, its energy policy, to meet its Paris commitments. This is huge, and we need to see more of this. Next slide. Finally, we got to get countries to internalize the problem, because clearly when they wrote the Paris Agreement, they didn't understand the scope of the problem. If they had, they would have had more ambition. And I hate the fact that the way we're going to get to countries actually complying is the floods in Pakistan or the melting glaciers here in Bhutan. We've got to get countries to realize the magnitude and the urgency of the problem. Next slide. So that's what we can do to improve compliance. What can we do to actually make this system more effective? Well, I'm going to give you 5 ideas here. And if we go to the next slide, yep. I've got my watch ticking. The next slide. We can get bolder commitments that are more ambitious. In Glasgow, the COP called on countries. They said, you didn't do your homework well enough. You didn't show up with a big enough commitment. Go home and make your commitments bolder. And we're going to have to add those up and see where they take us. But we need more ambition. Second, next slide. We also need to change financial flows in a bigger and bolder way. And you may not have noticed this buried in the Sharm el-Sheikh outcome document on loss and damage, but this to me is the biggest piece of loss and damage, because the U.S. isn't going to give this trust fund that was created a vast sum of money. But there is called upon to the World Bank and the other international financial institutions to fundamentally realign how they operate to be consistent with the goals of loss and damage. And if we can really rework these financial flows, that may make a big difference toward effectiveness. Next slide. Market mechanisms. You know, we're lawyers and we want to say it's all found in the text of the treaty, but sometimes we got to get outside the treaty. And I think that the carbon trading under Article 6 of Paris may be a way to do that. I won't say more about it, but I think we have to embrace the market, not reject the market. Next slide. And this comes back to transparency. It's about how do we get to move beyond governments that are slow and not making big enough promises, and about how do we harness the private sector. And we are seeing a rapid movement toward climate-related disclosure requirements. The TCFD released a set of these. There's a bunch of different sets now. The EU has enacted them. The UK has enacted them. The US SEC is thinking about it. And if we can get corporations to actually show what their carbon impacts are, corporations will be responsive to the flow of money. And this can be an incredibly powerful mechanism of transparency to promote effectiveness. Finally, it's about ambition. And how do we get more ambition? Well, the Glasgow summit was all about ambition, and we have to keep ambition on the table. But again, we need examples. What's the country that has been in some ways most ambitious? We're sitting in it. And that's a story, last slide please, that I think needs to get told. And I would love to see Bhutan's story talked about more openly at places like COP28 in the UAE. Because when the rest of the world has to hang their heads in shame because they have not been able to do what Bhutan has done, that may ultimately be the real source of ambition, the answer to effectiveness, and a compliant set of countries with the international legal regime. Thank you very much.